Somewhere in Sand Hollow is a very disappointed Cookie Monster.
Today's gonna be a good day. Wake up. Today's gonna be
Okay, working on another problem on our TJ here. We've made some adjustments to our front axle, where we've brought the front axle forward so that our bump stop is now aligning at least front to back with our factory bump here. However, we still have an issue of the bump stop is actually not landing on our bump pad. And we've also got this issue where the bolt head is chewing up the inside of our bump stop. So to correct this, we're making new 4-inch diameter washers for the bump pad to land on. So this will give us a little bit more, about a ½ inch more from the center over space for this to land on. And we have sized these specifically to match the inner side diameter of our spring, so that we've got a little bit, we still have some play around the spring so it doesn't hang up on the spring, but bigger to give more of a landing. We're also going to chamfer the inside of the washer to allow the bolt to sit as close to flush as we can accomplish on that bump pad. So this allows this to sit down lower and not provide as big a surface to erode our bump pads. In a perfect world, we'd actually chamfer this a little bit deeper than this one is in order to allow this to sit completely flush. Unfortunately, my 3/4 inch diameter chamfer bit, that's as far as it goes. We may look for a bigger bit over time and try to make this better, but as it is, that's a whole lot better like that than it is with the bolt head sticking up out of the edge here. So there'd be a lot less to chew away of the edge of our bump stop. Now, to make these, you could start with a piece of plate and grab a hole saw, cut a hole out. If you had a CNC table, you could just program it up and tell the CNC table, cut me out a 4-inch diameter circle with a ½ inch diameter hole in the middle. That would work really well too. I don't have a CNC table, but it turns out on Amazon, for a lot of this kind of normal stuff, there are people that will cut these out and sell them. So you can get a 1/4 inch, 4-inch diameter circle just shipped to you for not a terrible price. Makes a nice starting point. Now the next thing you have to do for what we're doing is locate the center of this. And there's a technique whereby you can take any 2 chords of a circle, and a chord is any straight line that intersects the circle at 2 points, find the center point of those chords, and then project a line at 90 degrees. Those will cross the center point of the circle. In my case, I do a 3rd chord and do the same with it, so that gives me kind of a double check to make sure that things are landing where they're supposed to.
That's the measure twice, cut once?
That's the basic idea. And then center punch that. Now there's a lot of different ways to find the center of a circle, right? Any tangent or line that's perpendicular to a tangent of the circle will cross the center. This method of using 2 or 3 chords gives you those tangents and a way you can do that. So now we need to drill out our center point and turn this disc into a washer. Because I don't want to have my fingers in here, clamps are a good thing.
Are you going to use cutting fluid?
I am. So now that I've convinced myself I have my center, intentionally set this up high to give myself room to get the bits in and out, because it's easier to change the drill bit than it is to find the center and to align the centers on this plate. So I'll change out the drill bit at each step, making sure that I leave the plate in place. That's why we made the first one first, rather than trying to build these and, you know, drill one hole, then the next hole, then the next hole in the pair of plates.
And this is just stepping up to the next size.
This is just stepping up to the next size. Our final size for this will be a 1/2 inch, which is a little bit bigger than what would be normal for this application, but at Sand Hollow we managed to shear one of these bolts. So opening it up, using a larger bolt to secure the bump stop to try to provide a little bit more strength on that as part of it. A smaller bolt would work better with my countersink bit as well. So this is a trade-off to get the bigger, stronger bolt through the center of the bump stops. This is the final step to the 1/2 inch diameter hole through the plate. Okay, so with our 1/2 inch hole drilled, we now have a hole that'll accept the bolt, but it's going to sit proud, and what we want is for it to try to sit flush. So we're going to countersink the hole. I have 2 countersink bits here that I'm going to use. This is a 20mm metric bit, and it has a 90-degree angle to it. This is a 3/4 inch SAE bit, and I believe it's an 82.5 degree angle on this. This is one of these differences between metric hardware and SAE hardware, where they use a slightly different standard countersink shank. I'm going to actually cut my hole first with this 20mm bit because it is slightly larger diameter, and this style of bit for me seems to cut just a little bit nicer in metal. And then I'll come back and touch it up with this SAE bit to get the correct angle, so that the bolt will mate nicely to the plate. So this style of bit just does a really nice job and produces a really nice finished hole, whereas the fluted bits seem to chatter more and the whole result is rougher.
Where'd you get that bit?
That's just off of Amazon. So for this is done with the metric bit and basically gone as far as it will go, because it doesn't have the ability to keep cutting once you reach the limit. And just kind of, there's just a slight lip here where it's cut below, straight below the surface, and no longer creating a chamfered edge to the surface itself.
Yeah, I can clip it with my nail.
Yep. So now we're going to switch to the SAE bit to correct the angle of the chamfer. And we'll see the difference in the type of cut that it leaves on the surface as well. Okay, and now you can come in here and you see that it's just not quite as clean of a cut. with the fluted bit. But that gives us our corrected chamfer for the bolt. And just verify that this is all going to fit together like it's supposed to. The bolt sits in there and it's nice and tight. And again, we're not completely flush like we would like to be, but this will be a lot less of an edge to chew up our bump stops. Take a couple of minutes and apply a little bit of a rust protection. So as part of this, we're going to go ahead and change out the shocks and try to see if we can get just a little bit longer body. That'll help us make better use of this additional length we've got here. So the way this works, we've got 2 bolts on the top side, tucked way down here in the engine compartment, that we want to remove so that the shock can drop free. We'll see if we get lucky and these will just spin loose.
This is where it's nice to have concrete floors and not gravel ones.
Yes, indeed.
Makes it easier to find those drop bolts and nuts.
When you Jenga, it's always easier to pick the pieces. Having a lift makes this really easy to just raise the shock up until it drops out of the bracket.
One more. There you go. These shocks are actually still good. We might reuse them on another rig, so it's good not to beat them up.
Definitely don't want to beat them up or hurt them along the way. So continuing on with the front end updates on the TJ here while we've got things apart, and that's really what this is about, is already having to take it apart to get springs out and everything else. Makes it a good time to look at this and deal with this. So here we have the old shocks that just came off, which were working fine, there's nothing wrong with them, and then the new shocks that we're going to put on. They're basically the same, but we see that we do have a little bit longer body on these new shocks. Again, we have, because we're not fully compressing the shock at bump, we have room for this longer body. And you know, kind of see that the body is roughly, call it 15.5 on the old shocks and 17.5 on the new. So that's nearly 2 inches more shock body. As we get down here to the end, we see that the old shock had about a 27-inch fully extended length, and our new are coming up at about a 30-inch. So again, almost 3 inches more length, extended length in the shock. So that's going to give us a little bit more down travel, and because we are going to limit the up travel with the bump stops, shouldn't be a problem on that end. Now a sharp eye will note that we have a bar pin on our new shock and just a bolt on the old. This is a function of being a stock TJ part. With the Artec truss kit, they convert to the standard bolt, so we will need to convert these shocks over to the standard bolt before we can install them. Somewhere in Sand Hollow is a very disappointed Cookie Monster. So we're just replacing the old bump stop with a refreshed version of the same thing, same length, just without the damage. On the stock TJ, these just screw in. Anti-seize is almost a prerequisite with these because of the way this will hold water, because even on a well-maintained rig, that will rust very quickly and become almost impossible to remove. The idea here is just to push the bar pins out of the bushing, or push the bushing out of the shock, whichever one chooses to give first. The bar pin is out, you just need to press the sleeve from the old shock into the same spot. So pre-assembling the bump stops so we can check them with the new leather. Again, anti-seize on these so that we can take them apart again in the future. And then we've got a very large heavy washer that will provide some additional support to these bump pads when they come together. Putting this together for a final test fit. We do expect we'll have to take this out to get the springs in here. One of the nice things about this design, however, is that it does allow for this to be installed and uninstalled while the springs are in, and the length of the bolt will allow us to add another puck to the bump stop length if we need it.
So the increased size, I kind of look at my finger, I'm sorry, I don't have a measuring tape, so we're going by the finger, and about a ½ inch on each side, so an inch total.
Just enough to kind of get everything held in place. Work these in a minute. So it's hard to see, but we do still have a gap here between this rubber bump on the shock and the shock, but that is fully compressed. We're landing on our new bump stop with a nice even space here on the back side.
Yeah, we didn't have that before. It was actually drooping off.
But again, there is a slight gap between the rubber here and the end of the shock shaft. So,
Like a ½ inch?
something like that.
Yeah, it's hard for me to get on camera with all the obstructions.
So it's enough that I can feel that it's there, but we're basically at the end of the travel on the bump, as well as the end of the travel on the shock.
Yeah, but look at all that. That's not going to deflect nearly as easily as it did. Which was the whole point.
With some of the other adjustments we've made, there's a risk of this bracket interfering with this bracket. Since we're not running a front sway bar on this vehicle, and at this point don't ever really expect to, we're just going to remove the bracket and avoid the potential problem.
Watch my new dip cover. You are really close.
Yeah, I know. And I'm the bracket removed, cleaned up. Now we're just going to do a little bit of rust prevention. So take the bump stop out. Okay, stuff the bump stop up inside the spring. Now this setup is such that it actually will, the components will all pass through the side of the spring as well. So if you get things out of order, or if you want to add an additional puck later, this can be done without having to remove the springs. And then work the spring into position.
Not a typical thing on your typical TJ, because this isn't the typical TJ.
And then there is a notch that the lower spring has to line up with, right down here. So you want the end of the spring in that notch, And then thread the bump stops into the hole. Now we are currently probably something like 6 inches beyond full extension here. So now we want to set it down and guide the springs into place. That shock is going to be fine. So yeah, she's not on the bump stops, which is what we wanted, was to not be on the bump at right height. Just using the impact to spin these bolt nuts down. Okay, so shocks installed, now at full droop, full extension. We've created a new problem here with the longer shocks. And what's going on is these shocks are actually about 1.5 inches, 2 inches longer at full extension than I expected them to be based on their specs. We may double check our part numbers, make sure we've really got the shocks we were expecting. But this has created a situation where the spring is now completely unloading at the top of the shock tower. This is not inherently a problem. This spring is not going anywhere. It's not going to come off the vehicle. It can't come out of the vehicle on the other side. But the fact that this is completely unloaded is a bit more than what we were really looking for. We've got a bit more droop in this front end than was actually desired. A couple of ways to address this. So there are a couple of ways to address this. One option would be a spring with a longer free length. We dealt with that actually with the other set of shocks. We had the same problem. We got the metal cloak springs that have a much longer free length than a lot of the others. So that's probably not going to be a great story here to find, a similar lift height with a longer spring. Another option would be a limit strap, which could then be used to limit the down travel to what is desired, what is appropriate, and wouldn't be too hard to put a limit strap into this configuration. A third is, a slightly shorter shock, which is probably the right answer. And again, we'll verify that we got the part number that we asked for based on the stats in a moment. The other concern with this is we are starting to reach a point where these hoses have some pretty sharp bends and potentially some pressure on them. I think we can address that when we look at how this one is being routed. I think we're okay there. If we turn this one around the other direction, we'll probably get some length back from it as well. We are planning to rework this ram with the new tie rod anyway.
I haven't told them about the new tie rod yet.
So this will be something we will probably resolve as part of that. So, and over here on the other side, we have basically the same thing going on in terms of the additional length where the shock is longer than was really desired. We do want to verify, we're here at full droop, that we don't have any problems with our brake lines. Making sure that at full lock, so this is not yet tight, though we do know there's certainly a possibility that we could have the vehicle crossed up. This could become a little bit of an issue, but this isn't bad. We'll check the other one as well. This brake line certainly seems to be fine. We've got an extra twist in it here somewhere, but it's definitely not to the point of being tight like a spring yet.
So AccuTune has confirmed that they've received the rear coils. They're working on those, getting those cleaned up, reserviced. I'm hoping to see them maybe a week and a half, so we can get those put back on Penny. And the suspension part should be ready to go for our next big adventure.
Okay, another day in the shop. Continuing to work with, because we have the opportunity, trying to do some fine tuning on the front of the TJ. We've got another set of shocks as we're trying to address this issue where at full droop with the new shocks we're now fully unloading the springs. So we've got a bit of a Goldilocks problem. This is our original shock that was too short. This was our attempt at a longer shock that was supposed to be 28 3/4 of an inch overall length. At 31, it is too long. So we are hoping that try 3 will be just right. We do see it is, again, a slightly longer body than the original. Definitely a shorter body than the second attempt. And we do see that it has a slightly longer overall extension than the original, but perhaps as much as about 2 to 3 inches shorter. This should be better. Now, let's get the label pointed in the right direction. Okay, with the middle length shocks installed and the tire up in the air, we're back to a state of having the spring still seated in its isolator here. So this is not going to come loose, it's not going to make noise, it's not going to decide to go AWOL in the middle of a trail run. Shock is here, so overall length looks good. Checking the same thing on the other side. Again, the spring is where we expect it to be. So next is to lower it down, make sure that there's at least as much shaft showing as we have distance between the bump plate and the bump stop. We have about an 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 of up travel before we hit the bump stop. And we have about almost 3 inches of shock shaft. So our shocks are not too long and they're not too short for this application at this point. So too short, too long, just right.